In this lesson, we're going to take a look at how we can get data from Prisma. So we've got our database set up and we have data in the database now. So the next step is to actually query that database and get data back from it. So we're going to refactor our lesson endpoint. And so we'll open that up here. And we don't actually need most of this. So we'll get rid of all of that. And I'm going to copy in this code here. So our new endpoint, we import the Prisma client. Then we create a new version of that client. And then inside of our event handler, we're going to grab this chapter slug and lesson slug, which we don't need quite yet, but we will in just a moment. And just to test it out and see that it works, we're going to first find that first lesson. So whichever lesson shows up in the database first, we're going to grab that. So to see these requests, we're going to come back to our hopscotch. Going to open up our Mastering Nuxt folder here. Lesson and come in here and we'll hit send. And our result over here is indeed the first lesson. And you know that it came from our Supabase database because we can see the created at, updated at fields, as well as the chapter ID and this ID here, which are not part of the JSON file. And we're not including the JSON file in here at all either. So that's just one method that we get off of this prisma.lesson object. And there are many, many more. So let's take a look at the documentation for Prisma. And you can see here that we have a lot of different CRUD methods for create, read, update, and delete. If you can see here on the side, you can see we've got a lot of different options for querying our data. We can create a single record or multiple at the same time. We can get by the unique ID. We can get all things in a database table. We can filter based on different queries. We can do all sorts of different things. We can select different subset of fields. We're going to go through a bunch of these different things. So we can update, we can also delete. So that's important to know. So the next thing we're going to look at is this find many. And as you would expect, when we query that, it's just going to return all of the lessons. If we want to be a little bit more specific on which we want, we can use this where clause. And let's say we'll put in chapter slug. If we capitalize that, then that's what we need to get that type to work correctly. So we save that and we'll run this again. And what we get are actually just 3 lessons. And these 3 lessons are all part of this first chapter. So in this way, we're able to filter which lessons we get, which objects we are returned from this endpoint. And if all we need is a certain subset of that data, we can put on this select clause. In this case, we're going to just grab the slug of each lesson. And there we get back a much, much simpler array of data. If we want to have Prisma not just find the lesson, but also include the chapter object, we can include it in the request. So we can include these nested objects. So if I run this, you can see that for each lesson in the first chapter, it also includes the chapter object nested inside of that. Now, for this particular query, this doesn't really make a lot of sense because we're just repeating this data. But if we change this to find first, for example, then instead of making multiple queries to fetch the lesson and then fetch the chapter, we can do it all in one single request. And our queries here can actually become very complex because we can nest these different clauses within each other. So if we want to include, let's keep this first query here. If we wanted to include the chapter, but we didn't want all this extra data, if all we wanted were the slug and the title of this chapter, we could change this Boolean to an object and put in a select clause that we just saw, set slug to true, and set title to true. Now, when we come over and query this, we'll see that this is a much simpler object in here. So this is just a pretty quick overview of the different kinds of things that Prisma lets us do. It's a pretty simple, straightforward interface on the surface, but it does give you a lot of power and expressivity to sort of change how you want to get your data. So you can nest things, you can do all sorts of stuff here. So it makes it really powerful. And I highly encourage you to check out these docs and see all the different things that you can do with the Prisma client. In the next lesson, we will be refactoring this lesson endpoint further and finishing it up so that we can return the correct lesson from this endpoint.